She started with the environmental movement and preparation for the Rio Conference. I joined her shortly after that in '93, and we agreed to add women legislators to that movement, not as individuals, but as a network. I persuaded my then male boss that in addition, we should also look to increasing the membership of parliamentarians for global action, women legislators, from 11% to 33% as a corollary goal. And in a meeting that we did of women's activists, we all agreed at a women's caucus meeting to make that the goal. So Bella is the one that I would credit with that 33%. She took a second step. She persuaded the key governments who were organizing these UN meetings that they needed to give space at those meetings for a daily meeting of the Women's Caucus, and made that an essential tool for consensus on conference outcomes. My organization agreed to add a legislators' conference at every preparatory committee, at the final conferences, and to put legislators on every official delegation. The governments of Sweden, Denmark, and the Ford Foundation agreed to fund this work. Most speakers of parliament at the time were men and had to be persuaded to include these women on those delegations. In the Indian Lok Sabha, all the women MPs marched on the speaker's office to demand that they all be sent to Beijing, that he had no right to choose among them. They were the largest delegation there. This gave NGOs clout on the floor, since legislators were inside the hall, while the NGOs had been relegated by the Chinese authorities to another city, Huairu, which was at least an hour and a half by bus away. The Women's Caucus became a permanent institution for any UN conference. Its daily briefings and daily analysis of the conference language and the negotiations became a key tool to get consensus on every treaty, convention, and agreement. And since Ambassador Correll is here, that includes the International Criminal Court, the latest treaty agreed, the Arms Trade Treaty, agreements on health, environment, women's empowerment. So we did change the norms. We are now 20 years post-Beijing. You all have seen the numbers. The numbers of women in parliament globally is now almost 22%, 21.9. It has taken 20 years to double. Our expectation is that in another 20 years, we will be at parity if the process continues as it is. At this point, there are 39 women speakers of parliament, which are 14% of the total. Since 1927, 90 parliaments have had a woman speaker at one time or another. Even more important than the politicians, in some ways, the parliament administrations, whether unicameral or bicameral, are on a parallel track. 20% of the Secretary Generals and clerks are also women. That too has doubled since Beijing. But the key question that many of you are asking is, what are these women doing once they are elected? And how are they increasing both their own effectiveness and what are they producing in terms of laws? So one norm that has begun to change within the structure of legislatures is that these women, to increase their own internal clout, have started to use the women's caucus model across parliaments. There are over 80 such women's caucuses. Some are formal, where the legislative system allows it, and some are not. But they all are cross-party and cross-issue. Many speakers don't like the fact that there is one, because then it goes around the party discipline. Party whips don't like it because it goes around what they would like to assign. In the US Congress, the caucus was formed by my members, Carolyn Maloney and Connie Morella, who were at Beijing. They even called it the Beijing Caucus, which was quite something in the US House of Representatives to have a caucus named the Beijing Caucus. In Pakistan, the first woman speaker, Femida Mirza, actually formally formed a women's caucus. And despite the terrible condition of security in the country, the Women's Caucus worked furiously to pass more laws on women's empowerment than any legislature in the country had done before. One of those laws against sexual harassment, which I worked on with one of my members, is up for an award this October by the World Future Forum. I have put up, since some items I have cut in my talk because others are covering it, but I have put up a little bit of a sample of the kinds of laws that women are producing and putting into on the floor. Part of the reason I want to just highlight this a little is that right after the Beijing conference, many of us were interested in what is it that women were going to do once they were in parliament. So we produced a legislative bulletin that took every initiative by women legislators, whether it was a speech, whether it was a private member's bill, whether it was a new resolution, and highlighted it, summarized it, linked it to the Beijing platform, and then circulated it in a bulletin. We were able to publish it for 5 years as a way of getting to the first review conference and taking a look at what it is that this was doing to move the process forward. The pool of people we worked with were 400 women legislators. At this point, I am developing a project that is going to revive an online version of this bulletin. And I will be happy to share it with all of you once it's in a setup phase. I will actually need the help of many of you because it will be something that will require academic research and analysis assistance. And I will also be putting it up for funding support because I think that this is an unmet area in terms of data and analysis and linking it to policy. There are about 47,000 members of parliament worldwide. In another 20 years, half of them will be women, and it would be interesting for us to see what it is that we are doing in terms of changing the norms and law and policy on this. I want to end though with this other question that you raised, which is where is the backlash and how can we deal with this? And it is something which, in a certain sense, is very difficult because it is a zero-sum game. Parliaments are not adding more seats. Men have to give up seats. There can be only one speaker. There can be only one chair of a committee. So these are positions for which women have to fight, and they have to fight in the same, unfortunately, rather dirty ways that the men do. And it is one of the things that we learn. In fact, I had to fight not only to get the job, but I even had to fight to be the one to go to Beijing, even though I'd organized it, my boss wanted to go instead. So these are the kinds of things that we all had to deal with. But in addition, we end up having to do the work at home and having to do the work at work in a 24/7 manner. Many of us do pay a very high price. 2 years after I was made Secretary General of PGA, my marriage collapsed, largely due to the visibility and the strain of this job. At Beijing +5, at the meeting in 2000, we brought 200 legislators from this network and asked them similar questions about what had happened to them in their personal lives. It was an extremely sobering report. Almost a quarter of them said they were not going to stand again after their first term in office. So we are dealing with an extremely difficult system as a politician who is a woman. And what the international and national systems can do to support that, to get to genuine equality of both power and responsibility between men and women, is an extremely important task that we have set ourselves as both policy and research communities. Thank you.
I'll start with thanking Stockholm School of Economics for inviting us and for giving this opportunity to present on what we as a group of men who believe firmly on gender equality and justice are doing globally. And then I'll be limiting to what we sort of, our philosophy tells us actually, and the way we work in terms of transforming the gender norms. Uh, the reason I'm using the transforming as a word or the transformation as a philosophy for us is I'll be explaining a little bit. But then I'll be looking also into some of the avenues that we need to further sort of strengthen our movement as well as our strategic direction in terms of really achieving gender equality, and that too looking from cultural norms and gender norms and value systems, which is more governed by structured factors. Uh, First, the Meninges Alliance, it's a global alliance of NGOs. Those work towards engaging more men and boys for gender equality and violence prevention. So here it's very important to highlight the word engaging, because we just don't want involvement at all, because that doesn't lead anywhere. It's just being there but doing nothing. So we believe firmly on engaging boys and men so that they take actions on their own and they be held accountable on their own actions as well. And also it has got decentralized regional and global sort of national alliances as well. And this is completely an informal sort of a network. It's not registered anywhere. The member NGOs and organizations contribute as much as they can given the limited resources we have, and we work collaboratively on those. And it has three strategic areas. One is capacity development and networking, where we do organize a number of capacity development initiatives to sort of engage with boys and men on these issues. And advocacy and policy, we do, member organizations do a lot of research around at policy level and also do advocacy around that in terms of ensuring these changes are being translated at different levels from policy to the cultural norms and factors around that. And then other is more on resource sharing and mapping. So what we also believe is that the information and knowledge needs to be shared widely as much as possible to drive the change that we are aiming for. The organization that I'm associated with, which is part of the Global Meninges Alliance, is Save the Children Radhaban. And we are basically child rights organization and founded based on the principles of UNCRC. And then there are overlaps between CRC and CEDAW, which helps us to really move into in terms of the field of equality and justice. What the reason I'm using the word transforming gender norms is actually just the fact that without transforming the way the girls and boys and trans children, I would not just go into the binary forms of gender, but then go beyond to include trans children as well. That there needs to be some transformation that needs to take place if we are aiming at gender equality. And we need to transform the way our minds work, our thinking works, and the way we behave if we really believe on equality and justice. And here we look at it from different areas. One major factor is about knowledge. Because of the gender socialization and the culture and the practice, which is governed by patriarchal practices around us, we need to help men and boys, including others as well, to really understand what is going on and what's the factors those are contributing towards the situation we are in. And then also we have to influence the practice, which is the key factor, which is in relation to changing the behavior. The way I behave as a man to other is very important, and we need to really bring or sort of bring the change on the way I behave and look at or treat other people. And then we do the larger advocacy and mobilization piece. And in the same time, our partnership is a very key factor. If we are trying to develop a movement, relationship becomes important, and that's where we sort of link up with other social justice movement, including women's rights groups, social environmental justice movements, and transgender rights, and also strengthening the movement and collaborating. We sort of, and then again the cycle goes on, because this is just in one area that requires a lot of attention. What needs to be changed then, and what needs to be transformed? Because as I said, we live in a patriarchal structure, and it's a structural issue. It's not what I, as an individual, believe. It does matter a lot, but then it also relates to how I put myself within the larger structure, and that's what governs the way I think as well as I behave. And there comes the issue of the whole, the masculinization, masculine space that is being created within this patriarchal structure, whereby men are supposed to be behave in a certain way and are guided based on the social cultural norms and practices that are in place. And you know, and these all are sort of an interrelated ideologies which prescribe the use and distribution of power. And this is where the crux lies. And we need to understand that this is all about how the power is distributed and what kind of influences different actions, responses, and relationship between individuals have impact on our own lives. And then this is where we need to sort of look at the unequal distribution of power in the system or the society we live in between the sexes, and sometimes it's even helpful between and among the sexes as well, because we can't sort of homogenize one sex as we are looking at a global picture. We need to add among as well, and then it starts from patriarchy, gender, and that the major of crux also is the gender division, and where the division of labor issues do come in. And then over control over body, sexuality, and the reproduction, as she was mentioning, these do come often. And these are some of the factors we need to take into consideration when we are looking at transforming gender norms and value system. And then that too, this is what it makes important as well, is that the cultural religious endorsement of different norms that and that we behave or function based on. And this is where we need to, and we have sort of looked into different areas and different cultural contexts as well, based on reasons, countries, or religions, and social cultural practices. There are some androgynous traditions as well. And we can sort of highlight those positive aspects and bring that in terms of addressing what we want to input. So I don't want to go into all this, and this is where I think I would like to highlight is the gender socialization, the socialization that each one of us go through and are sort of supposed to think on a certain way, certain direction, and behave accordingly based on what is so-called accepted within the cultural practices or societal practices. And this actually starts not one becomes age of 18, but at very, very early age. And that's where our practices at organization Save the Children, we do believe firmly that we need to act as early as possible if we are really looking into the sustainable change as well. And different messages and stereotypes, and we need to look into different variables through which one gets or internalizes the different forms of cultural and social norms or religious norms in order to sort of breeze or unbreeze the equality and gap. And children, and as I said, childhood, as for us, we look at as the window of opportunity to really look at the just society at large, and we can be very effective. And when we work as on transformation, we really need to look at it as a tree, which is how a tree is structured. So until and unless we really look at the roots of it, we really can't transform the society that we live in. And that's where the crux is we need to really try and dig the roots of factors. And then along the line, the reason why I'm focusing here, apart from the works that we do with girls empowerment and other such, is why do we work with boys and men? We can't imagine that all men and boys are violent, and also none of the men and boys are born violent. And we do believe that a lot of violence appears predominantly to be associated with boys and men, but this doesn't mean it's an essential feature of being a biological man. Uh, so we strongly believe that there is a sense of hope and expectation and possibility among boys and men to change, to care, to love passionately, and to work for and strongly believe in justice for all. And there has been several reviews as well to sort of say on this one, and this is one of the bench for us, which was done in 2007 to look into some of the health-related programs. Those were really looking into gender transformative tools and how do we move on. Just to sort of give you an idea of why I'm talking so confidently is because of these factors. We do have some practical examples whereby we have been able to bring out these changes, and this is one of the projects that was started in Nepal and now being replicated in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka in South Asia. And the primary objective was to empower both boys and girls. Here, when we work on gender norms and value system, we can't segregate it as boys, men, or girls, and because we all sort of are in the same structure or the set patriarchal structure, we need to ensure that all are included. And so this is one. And then as an outcome of these projects, a number of boys, and we are talking about women's leadership, and boys actually turned out to accept very openly the girls' leadership in their own settings, in the villages, in the groups that they have in the villages. So that led to other, including the child marriage issues. The boys themselves were moving along with girls in the community to fight against child marriage, and they were adopting interesting sort of strategies to deal with, and there are others as well. There are other similar curriculums called Choices, which was again evaluated, and this was developed again in Nepal, but then now it has been scaled up globally, including especially in Africa and Latin America. And we have a rigorous evaluation procedure which has shown us that there are changes in attitude as well as behavior. And then lastly, I would slightly touch on why we don't only work with young people, which is a very strong component, but then we also work with adults. And here we do globally work on issues of men care and fatherhood. And this is another important component when we look at gender equality and violence prevention, especially also looking at from violence against children point of view. And so 3 areas, and just one I would like to highlight is we are currently working and within the men care group is that we are trying to come out with the state of world's father report as well. We will whereby come out with the status, sort of a engagement of father in childcare and maternal health, and how much men are willing to transfer. And then finally, change is slow, yes, but then it's possible. But it's very, very slow than we anticipate it to be. But given the urgency of matter, we need to move a little fast, and change the situation that begins with us. So each one of us have to transfer the way we think and look at issues. Thank you.
So, can you hear me? So, when I read the concept note of the conference and the title of this panel on whether changes in social norms are fast or slow, I began, I'm an academic economist, and I began with my own research, and I haven't had years and years behind me yet, but even in my limited career, I found it's complicated. So I will give a couple of examples that I think speak to the fact that the impacts of development programs, they look very different in the short run versus the long run, and in different contexts, the impacts can be completely different even on those time frames, right? And that's something I've learned in my own research. So the first example I'll give is this work I did as a graduate student was on maternal and child health program in rural Bangladesh. This program was begun in the late 1970s, right after Bangladesh became Bangladesh, and it was a family planning maternal and child health program. And it was innovative at the time because it was set up in an area called Matla, which was about 60 kilometers south of Dhaka, but was very hard to access, very conservative, agrarian, high fertility, and very poor setting. One of the last settings in which you would expect fertility to decline, especially in this era. So the program was established in 1877. It was, it was largely a maternal contraceptive program where they hired local health workers. So there were in every village, there was almost 1 or 2 women who had completed school, who they trained to become health workers in their communities. And the program provided doorstep delivery of basic healthcare services with a heavy focus on contraception to married women in their homes every couple of weeks. So the idea was that you need to reduce the costs of accessing care, and the costs are not just economic, but they're also the time costs and the social costs and so on. And the technology they were really innovating was injectables. So women could control the use of contraceptives and also manage the side effects because the workers would come by every 2 weeks. And over time, they built in, tetanus inoculations, vitamin supplements, lots of different things into this program. And what the researchers at the time, who were mainly demographers, what they found unexpectedly was that change occurred very rapidly, right? So the declines in fertility were astounding. They were, the uptake of the program was very high, and that, women were quite willing to use these concealable contraceptives, discuss them with other, mothers-in-law, and so on. And fertility fell in a span of, a couple of years, quite significantly. So on average, women who were exposed to the program increased birth spacing. So it was packaged not to reduce the number of births, but increase birth spacings. And over a span of a few years, we found about a 20% drop in fertility, which means women, and this was done in the framework of a randomized controlled trial, and over the women who were targeted by this program had about 1 less child over the course of their childbearing years. The age at first marriage, the age at first birth did not move much, but because of the birth spacings, fertility dropped. Right, and this was quite rapid change, and the uptake of things like tetanus shots was also quite high. This was a society where prior to this program, tetanus was believed to be an entrance of the spirit into the body, and there was a reluctance to use modern healthcare. But with local women providing the care, the education, the awareness, and the products themselves, uptake was very high, and change occurred quite rapidly. Now, what I did as a graduate student was basically fast forward 20 or so years and try to see long-term changes, right? The short-term changes were demographic, they were health, but what about the long-term changes? And what I looked at was economic variables, women's participation in the labor force, sources of drinking water, assets, income, weights and heights of women and other family members. And me and my co-author, who is my thesis advisor, Paul Schultz, found broad effects, right? So we found over the course of 20 years, women who were targeted by this program, or women who were exposed to this program, they had 1 less child, but they had substituted both time and resources away from child rearing, and also engaged more in precautionary saving, buying more jewelry. They had improved their sources of drinking water. They had, participated a little more in the labor force. And these economic effects were not visible in the short run, right? Because this took 20 years to be manifest. And the lesson, I think, over there is that one type of change was very short, but it unleashed a broader process of change over a long time, which was much more profound, right? So fertility reduction of 1 less child had long-term consequences. There are other examples of this from other societies, but for example, we were talking during break how there is evidence that reductions in maternal mortality in a place like Sri Lanka was associated with greater investments in women's schooling, again, over a very long period of time. Causality in that study is very difficult to disentangle, but in the case of the Matlab one, we can start to, the randomized controlled trial framework of it permitted us to establish some sort of causal linkage. you know, the second example I'll give you about short-term change versus long-term change comes from some work I'm doing on self-help groups in India. So this is, very much a new program. The National Rural Livelihoods Mission, the NRLM, is attempting to organize women into self-help groups, all across India. And the goal is not just kind of economic empowerment, livelihoods creation, but social and political empowerment as well. So me and my co-author from Georgetown, we're Sam Winstead, and now Anders is joining us in the longer term evaluation of this program. We're interested in looking at, well, what happens to women when we form self-help groups. So in partnership with the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, SEVA, we studied the creation of new groups in Rajasthan in the year 2007. And we studied them in the framework of a randomized controlled trial where some villages in a district received SEVA's interventions of forming women's groups, and other villages served as controls. And the short-term impact over there was basically that when you form women, and this was recently published in the WBER, when you organize women into self-help groups, one of the first things they act on is drinking water. It's rural Rajasthan, so maybe this is not surprising, and it's very much overlaps with Rohini's earlier results that women are the ones fetching the drinking water. It's hot, water is scarce, so maybe that's one of the first things they do. So we see collective action in the area of drinking water. We do not see that the purpose for which these groups were originally formed, which is livelihoods creation, credit, etc., we see very little movement in any economic indicators over these 2 years. Now, with Anders, we are trying to think about how to evaluate this on the longer time horizon, and I expect we will find that again, the short term, the movement on drinking water is different than what we'll find on the long term. Long term, maybe our hypothesis is that we might find more effect on political participation, on participation in village institutions, and perhaps some economic impact as well, though this remains to be determined. But the broad conclusion I came to, and I have another paper on evaluating the Indian Safe Motherhood Program that provides cash incentives to women for giving birth in hospitals with medical care. And again, short-term impact very different than long-term impact. The short-term impact was, yes, an increase in hospitalizations, but the long-term impact, I suspect we will see declines in maternal mortality, and there might even be impact on, use of sex-selective abortion technologies. The moment you bring, pregnant women into the fold of the medical system, you can see, providing them with information. I don't know which way will it go. Will it reduce the reliance on, or will it result in increased son preference or not? I don't know. But again, I think given there are policymakers in the room, it should surprise nobody that some change is very quick and some change takes time. Not all change is what we expect, both in the short run and the long run. But the plea I would make is that studying these programs over time is what allows us to study change in the first place. Dr.
Thank you very much for very interesting introductions. And then we open up the floor for questions.
I really found your presentation just now really quite thought-provoking, because just curious as to what the main driver was of that fertility change in Bangladesh. In Iran, of course, I'm sure you're aware of that precipitous drop in the 1990s from one of the highest fertility rates to one of the lowest, and it keeps getting lower, and in Tehran it's below replacement, and that has caused all this anxiety on the part of the policymakers. But we usually attribute that to educational attainment, but also to government policy that occurred after Khomeini's death and the new government. So what was it in Bangladesh? Because there were these very strong programs in Iran, which I'm sure you know about. The compulsory seminar for young couples and so on. What was it in Bangladesh? I mean, yeah.
So yes, and the Iranian example was designed with Bangladesh in mind because you know this idea that it is the local healthcare worker.
Oh yes, of course.
You know, was very much inspired by Bangladesh. I think that was one of the big lessons is that change comes easier when it has a local face. You know, and the network of healthcare workers across Iran is to be, you know, and not just the mullahs and, you know, but there was a very local flavor to the program in both Iran and Bangladesh. It wasn't adopted from Bangladesh, but a lot of the lessons learned were implemented in Iran. Now, what was it in Bangladesh? You know, we don't know, right? From the standpoint of data speaking to us 22 years later, I cannot tell. But my hypothesis is that in its early stages after the creation of Bangladesh, this area was very poor. Fertility was quite high, and it was 5, 6 children per woman. Landlessness was becoming a very big problem. And I think that the message of a smaller family is, you know, I think the key issue is mortality, right? Women will have lots of children when they fear that some of their children will be lost. And I think the packaging of contraception with better maternal and child health did the trick over there because the children that were born had a higher probability of survival. And that was made very clear in these door-to-door campaigns. So explaining to a woman that she should increase the gap, the interval between her births, and that would maximize the probability of child survival, and vaccinating her and her children as well was, I think, in some of the anthropological studies that occurred in Bangladesh at this time, that message comes clear, that it was the focus on health, not just contraception that did it.
Can I add something here?
I was wondering.
Okay, thank you. So there's a study, and now I'm blanking on the authors, in the US that looked at variation across US states in the 1960s and 70s in women's ability to access oral contraception, just when the pill came on board.
Right.
And what they found in those states was that the states that women were able to have early access is that precisely the same thing that you're talking about happening, which is that, yes, fertility went down, there was greater spacing, and 20 years later, they've gone and studied those same areas, and you see an increase in education, increase in female labor force participation, and you see actually benefits going to the next generation. So very similar experience, and I think in some sense it is the fall in fertility that allows all these things to happen for whatever reason.
At the risk of sounding like a very economist here, it's the underlying, for me it says that people are sort of rational and respond to these incentives everywhere, right? Everybody wants their children to survive. And if you offer people a pathway to safer motherhood, healthier children, the economic benefits come later, but they do come, but those ones come first.
I think there's also a factor in reproductive health policy around the world that there is a large unmet need, and that the minute you actually provide the services, people will take them up. And I think that's part of the problem with a lot of countries where reproductive health services have not been available, that we've assumed we have to convince people to use them. Actually, you actually just have to provide them, and provide them locally where they can access them easily. That's what happened in Bangladesh.
I can take a question then. So once again, thinking a little bit about this kind of interaction between social norms and laws and regulations. I guess the picture that kind of emerged to a great extent in this panel and also the discussion we had earlier is that in many ways these are more complementary. That as social norms are developing and becoming more progressive, it becomes easier to implement laws and regulations that are more progressive, and the other way around. Implementing these laws and regulations that are more progressive, we also increase the pace at which social norms are progressive. But I'm wondering, are there ever examples of when particular, I guess, implementing certain laws and regulations in a way which you can think about it prematurely or too quickly and so on may also lead to certain backlashes in terms of social norms and expectations. Can, parts of society feel that these laws and regulations are not consistent with the sort of local culture, that they're imposed from the outside, therefore create more of a backlash rather than more aggressive force. Is there also a risk that if this legislation, because it's not in tune with social norms, is not really effective, and therefore legislation and regulatory changes generally becomes kind of lacking in credibility for the future and so on? I mean, is this something to be concerned about? Something to think about? Always have in mind in terms of adjusting, how we do change the regulation.
I mean, I'm not sure about backlash, but I think that the case of India and gender-based violence legislation is relevant in the sense that it's clear that kind of sanctions against violence, in particular against spousal violence, are not widely accepted. And a large proportion of police, for example, I can't remember the actual study, but it was in the 90s percent, agreed that a husband is allowed to rape his wife. I think among the judiciary, there are similar sorts of attitudes which are quite pervasive. And I think under those circumstances, it's very difficult, I think, to make progress. There's been some interesting kind of legal scholarship looking at the ways in which kind of that's been interpreted, and the idea, I guess, of public spheres and private spheres, and the law should not go into private spheres and so on. I don't know whether it's kind of counterproductive in those circumstances, whether or not it's actually more of a risk for women, or whether you would still argue, which I think I probably would personally, that it's still important to put the sanctions there on paper, and then hopefully over time, lead to some sort of change. So I think there's a large risk of ineffectiveness. I think there's probably less risk of actual damage. But I think it's always important to realise that the risk of non-implementation is very high for all sorts of legislation, but including.
I think there is backlash, which is easier to document in the reproductive health area as well, which is that, this was a major revolution, the pill as well as injectables, to be able to take care of your family planning without involving negotiations with your partner. But at the same time, politically, you see across certain countries, not just Ireland and Poland, Spain right now is in the process of reversing its abortion laws. There's heavy debate as well as counter-protests taking place on both sides, but they're about to reform them to the point of making abortion again almost illegal. And that has happened in the US at the state level in certain states. So it is, this is part of the kind of backlash, because it is the first step of empowerment of a woman to be able to control her own fertility and her own body. But at the same time, there is also, I think, on the economic front, I'm always very wary when gender empowerment programs are only looking to create jobs and opportunities for young girls and women, because then there is a level of resentment building up among unemployed young men. And that has been shown also with acid attacks and things like that in Bangladesh and other places. I think it is important for those of you who are designing these policies, for donor agencies that are funding this work, that there be the equality principle must apply. So you do need to include 50-50 men and women, or 40-60 either gender. I mean, in the organization that I used to run, we brought in the principle of 40-60 either gender in the board elections. It's still the only parliamentary body that has that, but there had to be a minimum quota for men as well, because otherwise there was going to be this enormous resistance. So there has to be some slight redesigning, but not to the point where you stop doing it. But you do need to bring in, I think, legislators say this all the time, that we're busy producing these laws, but then we can't be the ones to ensure that the police is going to enforce them, that the local authorities are going to, take a stand. And, when you were talking about development earlier on this notion of awareness and empowerment and agency for change, I kept thinking that, perhaps building more accessible toilets all over would be of great help, because it's women looking to go and take care of business in private who put themselves into a lot of physical danger, like the two young women recently in India. So, I mean, to some extent, providing basic services where they are accessible and funding those. Not always expecting everything to be done through a micro enterprise self-help model, but that the public sector, through a tax and spend basis, actually comes in to provide those services in a wide enough space to make it easier for women.
I have a question. So when we talk about going back to female leadership and changing norms and laws, so we have the quotas, which is one way to get women in, and then we have these media programs that Raquel talked about that change behaviors among women on the number of kids they want and so on, if we refer to La Ferrara's study. So could media or could information be used in firms to change norms or culture instead of quotas, in a way that you have, I don't know, role models that are exposed to females in management organizations, or even that you have firms that are using kind of male or other firms as role models for how you can have women. So we talked about this a little bit in the previous section, where they said that Sweden could be a kind of a front figure or a role model in developing countries. Do you know of that this is done, or do you believe that quotas, more general quotas, or can change is the way to go, or should you use kind of more information and so on, change the way that you have more information?
Is that directed to to the entire?
To the panel.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think the best evidence we have is, I think, that works best is when you see a person in that role for reasonably sustained amounts of time. And so, if in a management thing, if you do a one-off presentation and you show a video, that's unlikely to have an effect. But if you can imagine having some kind of secondment system where organization that doesn't have many women sort of gets one from another organization 6 months or something like that may have more of an effect. I think the closest to that I know is there's recently been Rockefeller's done a bunch of studies on exposure to female teachers in public school in California. Those effects are very large.
So what did they do?
If they were just exploiting homogeneity in gender of a teacher you saw, and basically both race and gender, but same race or same gender with huge difference to performance. So I think those effects are large. It's just question of what amount of how long exposure you want. I think what's some little striking is how fast fertility has responded to these soap operas, because in other places you don't actually see it respond that fast.
I mean, this is kind of not completely related, but let me just try anyway. One of the things that I think people sometimes are not even very self-aware on these fronts. So when you have, there's going to tell you about 2 experiments. One experiment that was done was actually in the sciences. They sent out, some resumes of graduate students to join labs. And this is in, for physics, chemistry, biology, forget what else, where being in a lab is an important part of your education. So this is postdocs. And they would give the person an advisor, and they would just have exactly the same resume, except it be a woman or it be a man. And then we'd ask them, the scientists across these different universities and different sciences, would they be willing to have this person in their lab? And what they found was that in the sciences, which considers itself quite objective, etc., they found both by women and by men scientists much more reluctance to be a mentor of a woman than of a man postdoc. And I think that for that community, and this is in the advanced world, this is in the US, was a big shock. The other thing that I think has been very successful is when people play those implicit association games. If you can force them to play those games. We did one of those at NYU where we had everybody, we had a large group of people come together, and they didn't know what the experiment was at that point, and they were asked to associate, women with, to put women when all these things came up, all these categories came up, career related, and then to put men when family things came up, and then to reverse it. And they were much faster at putting women with house-related things and men with career-related things, and much slower at the reverse. Right? And so people are kind of surprised about that, about themselves, because a lot of people believe themselves, and again, this is not particularly pertinent for developing countries where I think people don't see it as a bias, but even in advanced countries, high GDP countries, people are kind of shocked to see the amount of bias I have. The question is, how can you get people to be involved voluntarily in doing those experiments? And whenever we do those type of experiments at a place like NYU, the only people you ever get are the people who are kind of interested in those issues already. So basically, there'll be no economists there, and they'll be the humanities professors, and they're all like 90% women. So you have to find a way to do it. I don't think showing a film at a firm will precisely doing it, but I think there are imaginative ways to engage people and to have them maybe become more self-aware in terms of their biases.
I am someone who firmly believes in affirmative action and quotas, whether it is related to the political system or even the private sector and the corporations, because part of what happens in both, whether it is political parties competing for an election or it is companies competing for profit, they want the playing field to be level between them and their competitors. So when you bring it in as a law, as a quota, it is something that everybody is required to do. So if every political party has to have a third of their candidates as women, every third seat on the party list, then they're all going into the election competing on an equal footing. If every corporation has to do X, then they are, more relaxed about the fact that their competitors are in the same boat. Otherwise, they won't take that first step and they won't actually take it seriously. And, you don't change behavior so easily voluntarily. It takes an awfully long time for it to change through a consumer process.
I have a question which I think is maybe mostly to Rahul and Jenny. So I think I started when you want by Rahul, which I completely agree with. We started talking about how the importance of incentives and how incentives can be a powerful way of even changing what people less norms and give someone enough money for you. One that you often see, which I think is striking, is how we often end up using norms because in the short term it serves the purpose we want. And I think a classic example of this is conditional cash transfers. So if you think of most conditional cash transfers, they're all targeted to the woman. And I was struck by this when I was reading these anthropologists, so it was mostly descriptive, describing about how one thing that Operation Douglas has done has reduced mothers' attachment to the labor force, because now they have to spend all this time taking their children for clinics and things like that. And also that it had emphasized the notion of la mamas, your role as a mother is emphasized much more than a labor force. And I have a sense that in none of the CCT discussions has this ever come up. We are all kind of very comfortable with the fact that women spend more on children rather than saying how do you get fathers to that point. There's much more those things will just go along with this. So I was curious about sort of, if you were to think about it, what would you say? And I don't know, Jenny, whether there have been any discussions about this in the bank, but it was actually something I hadn't thought about until I read that piece about how striking you were reinforcing a certain norm.
I mean, I've always thought about it. It's always bothered me how we're making, the mother with all the maternal duties that comes upon it. That's why that's why I kind of like the Swedish, the Norwegian model of thinking about incentives to get men engaged, rather than necessarily saying, oh, the mother is the one who cares more about the children, therefore let's give her the money. That sometimes may be completely the right thing to do, and I'm not saying not. But I was also always worried about, well, you start to see your child as a commodity. I mean, this can be used it's used for school, for dentists, for health visits, and like you're saying, not only does it take up a lot of time and weaken women's labor force participation as a relationship, but it's also, it becomes a commodification, in my opinion, of a lot of things that I'm not necessarily comfortable seeing commodified that way. And again, I just think it's a question is, do we want to put prices and monies for everything? And so there's lots of ways to create incentives. Monetary ones are very powerful, particularly in the world that we live in, but there might be other ways to do it as well.
Well, I think in the mainstream kind of discourse of the bank around conditional cash transfers, there's so much excitement about the results that I think potential adverse effects not necessarily being very as well.
People study the text for the mothers,
On the mother's time and so on.
or the employment, or the.
No, typically not. So I think it's right to be highlighting this and highlighting the burdens of time and the reinforcement of stereotypes and so on. I think that there are more recent studies like the Malawi one, the Gosnell one, yeah, with the unconditional cash transfers, which is quite nice in the sense that it shows, I think, bigger results for the unconditional than for the conditional. And so I think if that gains some kind of support, kind of traction, then there may be more kind of interest in pursuing those routes and not necessarily enforcing the conditionality, because oftentimes, you know, it's the resource constraint of the family. They may not need the condition in order to be able to kind of pursue the good behaviour. So I think that there were kind of various assumptions embodied in the conditional cash transfer model, which aren't necessarily ones that we want to go with. But I guess just one other thing I wanted to put on the table, I'm not sure when we're supposed to close.
5 minutes?
5 minutes, yeah.
Are there opportunities, because you're looking at the panel?
No, there are opportunities.
Okay, because I have a very important element that has not been mentioned today.
Yes, please, and then we can.
Okay, well, one thing, Shashanatha mentioned, it takes time to change rules. The basis for all this, if we are going to change here, is actually societies under the rule of law. And when I look back after my many years on the bench, the Minister of Justice, Foreign Office in the United Nations, and ask myself, why is the situation as it is in so many places in the world? Why are there conflicts? There are two elements missing there, democracy and the rule of law. This is my firm opinion. And this is also something that was discussed by an association of former heads of states and government. Malcolm Fraser from Australia, Jean Chrétien, and Helmut Schmidt. And all of a sudden, Helmut Schmidt asked the question, do politicians understand their responsibility for the rule of law in their societies? Because unless there's rule of law, it's very difficult to change the rules. Now, this gave birth to a small, how to say, pamphlet, it's 40 pages only, called Rule of Law, a Guide for Politicians. And I understand that this will be circulated, the link to that. So it's translated now into 13 languages, and there are 4 more languages coming in the author. It's only 40 pages because politicians are so busy, so they don't have time to read books, and by the way, which books should they read? So this is a common, shall we say, effort by the Ron Wallenberg Institute in Lund, in Sweden, and the Hague Institute for Internationalization of Law. And I cannot stress enough, against the background of my experiences, both at the national and international level, the rule of law is the key element. There are 4 very brief points here. Number 1, I already mentioned, democracy. Why? To achieve the second element, namely legitimate legislation that observes international standards of human rights. Number 3, the institutions to administer this law, including independent courts. And the most difficult of them all, the 4th element, the individuals with the knowledge and the integrity to run these institutions. And please keep this in mind all the time, because unless that's present, it's very difficult to make changes that last.
I would take exception to your element number 1. I think that we've had very long-term changes in non-democratic societies. If you think of South Korea, the other Asian countries, China, and so on. I think it is important, but I would place your number 4, number 1, and your number 1 and number 4.
But I'm not sort of putting them in an order. And I fully understand I'm involved in the International Bar Association with the work in China, which is not a democracy, but certainly we should work on the rule of law there. And I mean, the guide is translated also into Chinese. So, and democracy is a problem, which is demonstrated, of course, by the situation in the United States of America, where I'm very worried when I saw the effects of the last presidential elections, where candidates for the presidency are availing to the electorate, vote for me, and I will use the waterboarding to extract information from people. That the whole nation is standing up as one man and one woman, simply saying, this is enough, this is passing the legitimacy. But this didn't happen. And I'm actually a member of the American Bar Association's board, of the international section, although I'm this week, and we are very worried when we are studying several elements here what's happening.
Jenny, you were going to.
Well, I guess it was just a point which was a bit more operational, and that was around the need, well, it's a question whether or not there's a need to be thinking more explicitly about normative change in the context of designing development kind of policies and programs more broadly. So, for example, with respect to economic opportunities, I think the assumption was that if women get jobs, they'll be empowered. But we know that in practice, there may well be other stuff going on at home. There may be also violence. They may not have control over spending decisions and so on. With education programs, there may not be, very close to kind of content and so on, and curricula. But we assume that girls who went to school were going to be kind of more empowered. So I guess the question is, and I guess with some of the health programs, you may give women somehow injectables, but you're not really addressing some of the other structural problems they might be facing kind of in the household and in the community more broadly. So I guess the question is whether or not it's okay to go with kind of approaches which are just focused on kind of specific outcomes, or whether or not if we want kind of a broader set of changes, whether we need to be explicitly addressing the need for normative change as well. I guess it was a question for the panel or for anyone else, but maybe too late in the day to be raising it.
Someone want to answer that? Or?
I guess what I would say is development policies almost always have unintended consequences. So even when you think your focus is narrow, think about the microcredit. There's so much, or still is so much excitement about it, but longer term, we have started finding and are likely to keep finding all sorts of unintended, good and maybe not so good. So I guess my hope would be that we just study these things broadly and over long enough time horizons to find them, and also solve some of these mysteries about what are the power structures within the household and how do you influence them more broadly.
So let's thank the panel for a great discussion and engaging discussion. And then we have Anders close the day.
Well, as Jenny was putting it, it's been a long day. There's been a lot of different topics, within this area discussed. And given my limited capacity, there's no way at this point in time that I'm going to be able to actually summarize this in a neat way that brings anything more to the table that hasn't already been said. So I'm not really even going to try and attempt to make any kind of summary of important facts and so on. I think it speaks for itself. Rather, what I may want to do instead is to encourage everybody who has been here as participants and also in the audience to continue this discussion. Continue this important discussion, around the globe, in different venues, wherever you're going from here, and try also to the extent possible to influence policies and influence activities and so on, according to what research is telling us have an impact and what works. And I think that's kind of part of what we're trying to do here with these development days, and that by bringing together both scholars and policymakers and people from different kind of avenues of life, also get at the core of what does the evidence actually tell us. It's not only about being emotional about it and thinking this is important. We also need to think seriously about what makes a difference, what works, what are potential negative effects of some of these things if we do. So I think that's sort of important. And of course, I also want to take the opportunity to thank all of you participants coming here. Many of you come from distant places and traveling for long times and so on. So I think we should give all the kind of participants here another round of applause. And I also want to thank the Ministry for helping with financing and organizing this event. And I want to thank you in the audience for being here and for your participation as well in the discussion. And I also want to let you know that we are going to summarize, and Evelyn over here has been working hard on the computer, writing down what has been said. So we are going to write up a summary of what has been said, and it's going to be published as part of our free policy briefs, which is a product that we at SITE have together with our sister research institutes in the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe, where we regularly publish sort of policy or reader-friendly, shorter versions of the kind of research that is taking place within our different institutions. So it will be available throughout both the Free Policy Brief webpage, the link you can see over there, and also through our own webpage site as well. And as you've been seeing as well, we have also been doing a webcast of this, so that should be available on YouTube. And we're also going to try to make a shorter version with some editing and then some commentary that you can also look at if you haven't had it. Okay. Great. So thank you so much, everyone, for what I think was a very successful.
Can I suggest a photo op?
That's a wonderful idea.
And may I suggest that someone use my camera first to take a picture of all of us who made presentations, eh?
Then how
I will indeed, I will definitely. I thought perhaps that homepage of the Stockholm conference.
See you tomorrow. Yeah, and I got the text also.
We should have some flowers here, right?
Yeah, we should have some flowers.
And note that they are pink.
So who would like to take a photograph of us? Thank you.
Free policy.
Free policy brief.
So for the dinner tonight, if you want to meet up, we're meeting outside of the big door, outside of the lectures here.
Here or the middle?
Here.
Okay, sure. Okay.
So we said, let's meet outside the main entrance.
Yes, it means before, I think.
We have like,
Over the front, right?
you're very close to
Maybe some people should be in the front of this table. Maybe you and I and Ina and the taller people back here, right?
Put this one away so it's not in the way.
I thought we were moving. Okay. Let's see. Like,
Sorry. Is it okay?
No, you're good.
how about one more, please, just in case?
Actually, switch off. Is it better switch off for the lights?
Oh.
Oh, no, this is the metro.
If I want to.
Well, now it's just turning up now.
We need some gender balance.
Yeah.
Come back.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine.
You have to share those pictures with us.
I will send them to Ina. Yeah. Thank you so much.
So, everybody, about dinner tonight. Ja. Okej, har vi sagt det? So everybody, can you have your attention for 15 seconds?
They're going to meet here, 10 to 7.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that everybody knows. And for those who prefer to go there right away.
Go where right away?
To the restaurant. So there are two options.
Oh,
So I
I
have
see.
a map here.
No,
So
I'd
if there's,
rather come
so
here.
if there's anyone who wants to go there straight away for 7,
So there's also Anders has a map in case anyone wants to go.
Yeah.
so that everybody knows we're joining us. Apparently we are meeting.
How about just in case
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I
Just
fall
in
asleep
case.
or something?
and as you, and I think, I don't know if the map is perfect, but if you have questions, ask me. So you will see where the restaurant is, and you will see where the Stockholm School of Economics is.
And where's the hotel?
And the hotel is up.
Okay,
So this is where we are.
Okay, and he's going to be where the restaurant.
okay,
And there's
okay.
You get extra ones?
yeah.
So we were just going to go for a walk downtown.
Okay.
Where should we go? Head.
If you want to go downtown, when you exit towards the main street,
Yeah.
you take a right
And just,
and just follow that.
Okay.
And you will get downtown.
Okay. Great.
The destination.
You at the hotel?
Okay.
I did the walk.
Oh, you had some time to do that? Okay, super. Yeah, we should talk
Dave.
about what to do tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, what's good for you? I'll adapt to you.
Yeah.
You're probably quite busy, right?
No, the only thing is Ina and Martina are presenting a paper for our seminar. So maybe I could be there, we could be there, however you want to do.
Yeah.
And then we're going to do our hosts tomorrow evening. To the extent that you have time and not too tired, we should hang out and discuss. And we probably, given that we're here, it would be more fun to walk around a little bit in the city, right? See a bit of the city. And we can talk.
But don't let me hog your
No,
day.
my day, except for that thing,
Okay.
my day is totally devoted to
How about this? I can also bring my laptop so that
Yeah.
if I need to do something, I can stay busy.
Right, right.
I'm flexible and I've
Yeah.
also allocated my day
Yeah,
that way.
okay, so you have a, okay.
I don't have anything.
So you probably want to sleep a little bit in the morning tomorrow. For 2 reasons, you jet lag, and for now you have an opportunity. So you really should.
There's no children.
Yeah, exactly. You really should. So I don't want to rush you. So, maybe you should come down to the school around 11 or something.
Sure, that works.
And then we have like an hour, we can look at the sun, we can chat,
You should
Yeah,
attend the
And then we
February
can,
seminar.
the seminar, and then maybe we can, after weather permits, we can take a little sightseeing.
No, I think it's,
No, that's perfect.
that you have.
Yeah, so, I'll work that out. I'll get that info from you tonight. Your office is at site,
Yeah, so, it's in this building,
this building?
the 9th floor.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, so it's a top floor, so actually elevators on the to the 7th floor, and then it's.
Very nice. Oh, it's like Georgetown.
Yeah, exactly, you're right. It's like Roger's office.
Yes, and your office was like, well, that's Betsy's, right? So, okay, no, sounds good. I love the idea.
Are you going to for good time now?
Probably, what are you up to?
I need to pack all these things up.
Yeah, do you need help?
No, no,
I'm sure.
Yeah, I have people here.
Okay, I'm happy to lend a hand.
Well, if you're all hang around.
I might go back and check on my kids.
That's
Make
like
sure
a-
nobody has destroyed anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, but I'll come back.
Outside here, maybe 10%.
Yeah, we decided 10 to 7 outside the main green door with the full key.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
See
you.
you
Have a
then,
great
Anders.
day.
Absolutely. Oh, my bad.